Tonight we walk along the muddy banks of the Indus River at dawn, and you're already in over your ankles. The water here moves slow and brown, heavy with silt carried down from mountains you'll never see, and you reach down with both hands to scoop up a fistful of wet clay. It squelches between your fingers, cold and alive, and somewhere behind you, just beyond the reeds, you hear the soft clinking of pottery wheels beginning their morning song. You're in the Indus Valley, roughly 5,000 years before anyone thought to invent insomnia, and the city of Mohenjo-daro is waking up around you. You probably won't survive this, but not because of war or famine. You'll probably trip over a brick and fall into a well, because these people built drains everywhere and you're not used to looking where you're going. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wipe your clay-caked hands on your tunic and stand up straight, squinting against the sun that's just now cresting the eastern horizon. The air smells like wet earth and smoke from cooking fires, and you can hear the low murmur of voices drifting from the city walls. But you're not quite there yet. You're still outside, still kneeling by the river where the clay is softest, and you realize that everything you're about to see, every brick, every pot, every seal, started right here, in this mud. The Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan Civilization as some scholars call it, built their entire world from the ground beneath their feet. They didn't quarry stone from distant mountains or import timber from foreign lands. They used what the river gave them, and the river gave them clay. You watch a potter further down the bank, a woman with strong arms and grey-streaked hair pulled back from her face. She works at a wheel that spins not with electricity or even foot power, but by hand, a simple pivot wheel that she turns with a stick before shaping the spinning clay with her fingers. There's something hypnotic about watching her, the way her hands move without seeming to think about it, the way the vessel rises from the lump like it was always there waiting to be released. You've seen potters before, in documentaries and Renaissance fairs, but this is different. This is the real thing, the original thing, the moment when human hands first figured out that mud could become more than mud if you just had enough patience and fire. Historians still argue whether the potter's wheel was invented here or borrowed from Mesopotamia, but standing here watching her work, you don't really care. The wheel turns, the clay spins, and you're watching a technology that would remain essentially unchanged for the next 50 centuries. She's not making art. Not exactly. She's making storage jars for grain, cooking pots for stew, little cups for drinking water, the everyday objects that kept a civilization alive. And she's making them by the dozens, stacking them in the sun to dry before they go into the kiln. You notice that none of them are exactly identical, even though they're all the same shape. There's a human variation to each one, a slight difference in the curve of the rim or the thickness of the wall, and you realize that's what handmade means. It means the person is still in there, in every piece. You walk closer, careful not to disturb her work, and you see that she's not alone. There are children nearby, maybe her grandchildren, playing with little clay animals that she's let them have, tiny bulls and elephants and what might be a monkey, though its tail broke off somewhere along the way. They're rolling them in the dust, making them fight, making them talk to each other in voices too soft for you to hear. And you think about how strange it is that you're watching this, that 5,000 years separate you from these children, and yet you know exactly what they're doing. You did it yourself, once, with plastic dinosaurs instead of clay bulls, but the game was the same. The imagination was the same. The laughter, you imagine, was probably the same too. The potter glances up at you and says something in a language you can't understand, something melodic and clipped, and she gestures toward the city walls. You nod, because nodding seems universal, and you start walking toward the baked brick structures that rise from the floodplain. Behind you, the wheel keeps turning, the soft clinking continues, and you realize that sound, that gentle, rhythmic tapping of potters' tools against clay, is the background music of this entire civilization. Everything else, All the grand architecture and complex trade networks and mysterious writing sits on top of that foundation. The clay whispers, and if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear what it's saying. You pass through the city gates and immediately regret not asking directions back to that river, because the streets before you unfold in a grid so precise it makes your own neighborhood look like it was designed by a committee of drunk snakes. Straight lines everywhere, running north to south, east to west, with main thoroughfares wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass without anyone losing a finger. You walk along a street paved with baked bricks laid herringbone style, and you notice that the bricks themselves are uniform in size, roughly 7 parts long to 4 parts wide to 2 parts thick, a standard so consistent across the entire civilization that archaeologists can spot a Harappan brick from 100 yards away. You're standing in a city planned by people who clearly believed that geometry was not just a suggestion but a moral imperative. The buildings rise on either side, 2 stories high in some places, their blank exterior walls presenting nothing but brick to the street. No windows at ground level, you realize, because privacy mattered more than curb appeal. The entrances are set back in narrow alleys, and you find yourself peeking down one of them, catching glimpses of interior courtyards where women spread grain to dry in the sun and children chase chickens that really don't want to be chased. The city feels alive in a way that ruins never do in photographs, and you have to keep reminding yourself that these walls, these streets, these people, they're all 5,000 years gone. The chickens are ghosts. The children are ghosts. You're the only real thing here, and you're not entirely sure how that makes you feel. You walk further and the street slopes gently downward, not by accident but by design. Every few yards you spot a rectangular opening in the ground, covered by a loose stone or a grate of baked clay, and you realize you're walking on top of the most sophisticated sanitation system the world would see until the Romans showed up 2,000 years later. Beneath your feet, a network of covered drains runs alongside the streets, carrying wastewater from the houses to larger channels and eventually out of the city. You crouch down and lift one of the covers, peering into the darkness below, and you can still see the smooth plaster lining that kept the water flowing without soaking into the brickwork. These people had better drainage than some apartments you've lived in. Historians still argue whether this obsession with cleanliness had religious significance or was purely practical. But standing here with your head over a drain, you lean toward practical. The Indus River flooded every year, bringing fresh silt but also mosquitoes and the diseases they carried. If you're going to pack 60,000 people into a city, you need to deal with the waste, or you're not going to have 60,000 people for very long. The Harappans dealt with it. They dealt with it so well that every house you pass has its own bathroom. A small brick room with a sloping floor that drained into pottery jars or straight into the street channels. You step into one of the houses through an open doorway, because apparently breaking and entering isn't a crime when the owners have been dead for 50 centuries, and you find yourself standing in a home that would feel almost familiar if the furniture weren't missing. The rooms are arranged around a central courtyard, open to the sky, where you can still see the remains of a brick hearth and the imprint of storage jars in the hardened earth. There's a staircase, or what's left of one, leading up to a second floor that's long since collapsed, and you imagine the family sleeping up there on warm nights, catching whatever breeze made it over the city walls. The walls themselves are plastered and sometimes painted, though the colors have faded to nothing but memory. You run your fingers along the surface and feel the smoothness, the care that went into this ordinary house, this home for people whose names you'll never know. You step back out onto the street and look both ways, though there's no traffic to speak of except for a ghost dog trotting past with its nose to the ground. The grid stretches on in every direction, and you realize that Mohenjo-daro wasn't just a city, it was a statement. A statement that human beings could impose order on chaos, could build something that would outlast them by millennia, could create a world where you could walk from one end to the other without ever getting lost. It's the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing, and you wonder where that confidence went. You wonder when we stopped building cities that made sense, when we started letting roads wander and drains clog and houses face the street like they're ashamed of something. Behind you, a pottery wheel starts up again, the soft clinking carrying through the morning air, and you realize that every sound in this city, every wheel, every voice, every footstep, is layered on top of that grid. The streets made the city possible, but the people made it alive. And right now, walking down this perfectly straight street with the sun warming the bricks beneath your feet, you feel more alive than you have in months. It's the strangest thing, being here. It's the strangest thing, being anywhere. You turn a corner and the street opens into a wider space, and suddenly you're standing at the edge of something that makes you stop breathing for just a second. It's a pool, but not like any pool you've ever seen. A rectangular basin sunk into the ground, lined with bricks so tightly fitted that you can't slide a knife between them, and sealed with a thick layer of natural tar that still gleams blackly in the morning light. The great bath of Mohenjo-daro stretches out before you, 40 feet long and 23 feet wide, with steps leading down into water that isn't there anymore but that you can almost see. You walk to the edge and look down, and the empty basin feels like a held breath, like the moment before someone speaks. You lower yourself onto the top step, dangle your feet into the space where water used to be, and try to imagine what this place looked like when it was full. The water would have been clear, brought from the river or from a well, heated perhaps by the sun or perhaps carried in warm by servants. People would have gathered here, on these same steps, at this same hour, watching the light play across the surface as the day began. You'd have heard the splash of someone descending, the murmur of voices echoing off the brick walls, the soft drip of water from cupped hands raised in some gesture you'll never understand. The Great Bath wasn't just for swimming. It was for something else, something that mattered enough to build this massive structure right in the heart of the city. You look around and notice the colonnades that once surrounded the pool, the rooms opening off to the sides where people might have changed clothes or prepared themselves for whatever rituals happened here. There's a well nearby, still there, that would have supplied the water, and a drain at one end of the pool, a massive corbelled drain, tall enough for a person to crawl through, that could empty the entire basin when it needed cleaning. You lean over and peer into the drain opening, and it disappears into darkness, carrying the memory of ancient water toward the city's edge. Historians still argue whether the Great Bath was religious or secular, whether it was for purification rites or just the world's fanciest public swimming pool, but standing here you feel like it might have been both. The Harappans didn't seem to separate their lives into tidy categories the way we do. Everything connected to everything else. You stand up and walk around the perimeter, your sandals whispering against the brick paving. At the bottom of the pool, you notice something you missed before. Small indentations in the floor, regularly spaced, that might have held wooden posts. A canopy, perhaps, to provide shade during the hottest part of the day. Or maybe they were for hanging lamps, so ceremonies could continue after dark, the flames reflected in the water below. You try to picture that, the Great Bath at night, torches flickering, the stars overhead mirrored in the pool's surface so that the people standing here would have felt like they were floating in space. You'd have seen your own reflection down there, surrounded by flame and darkness, and you'd have wondered, just for a moment, whether the person looking back was really you. You sit down again, this time on the opposite side, and you watch the archaeologists who are working nearby. Ghosts, you remind yourself, they're ghosts, carefully brushing dirt away from something small and delicate. They work in silence, or what passes for silence here, their brushes making soft scratching sounds against the earth. You realize that they're uncovering the same steps you're sitting on, that they're the ones who found this place after it had been buried for thousands of years, that without them you'd be walking over empty dirt with no idea what lay beneath. The Great Bath was excavated in the 1920s, and it's been puzzling scholars ever since. No other Indus city has anything quite like it. It's unique, special, a one-of-a-kind structure in a civilization that otherwise seemed to prefer standardization over spectacle. A woman walks past you, a ghost woman from 5,000 years ago, wearing a simple cotton garment and carrying a small pottery jar. She descends the steps, carefully, gracefully, and at the bottom she kneels and dips her jar into water that you can't see. She fills it, rises, and walks back up the steps, passing so close to you that you could reach out and touch her if she were really there. But she's not really there. She's a memory, a projection, a trick of the light and your own imagination. And yet, for just a moment, you felt her presence so strongly that you almost apologized for being in her way. The sun climbs higher, and the shadows in the great bath shift and shorten. You realize you've been sitting here for longer than you meant to, watching water that isn't there, waiting for rituals that ended before anyone thought to write them down. The soft clinking of pottery wheels drifts over from somewhere in the city, and you hear the lowing of cattle, the call of a vendor, the everyday sounds of a civilization going about its business. You stand up, brush off the seat of your pants, and walk back toward the steps. Before you leave, you turn and look one more time at the empty pool, the brick-lined silence, the place where water once danced under ancient stars. And then you walk away, carrying the image with you like a secret you'll never tell anyone. You follow the sound of the pottery wheels, letting them pull you away from the great bath and back into the winding residential lanes where the real work of the city happens. The sound grows louder as you approach, not just one wheel now but several, their rhythms overlapping and intertwining like a percussion ensemble warming up before anyone thought to call it music. You round a corner and find yourself in a potter's courtyard, open to the sky, where half a dozen wheels spin at once and the air smells like wet earth and something sharper. Kill smoke, maybe, or the mineral tang of glazes heating up. You've arrived at the industrial heart of the Indus Valley, and it looks less like a factory and more like a dance. You watch as a potter takes a lump of prepared clay and slams it onto his wheel, centering it with a few practiced thumps before setting the wheel spinning. His hands move in patterns you can barely follow, one inside the forming vessel, one outside, both working together to pull the clay upward into a shape that seems to emerge from nowhere. Within minutes he's produced a jar, smooth-walled and elegant, its rim flaring slightly outward in a gesture that feels almost human. He cuts it free with a piece of string, lifts it carefully, and sets it on a wooden board with a dozen others, all identical, all perfect, all made by hands that have done this 10,000 times before. You step closer, drawn by the hypnotic repetition, and you notice that not all the potters are adults. A girl of perhaps 10 sits at a smaller wheel, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrates on forming a tiny cup that would fit in the palm of your hand. She's learning, you realize. She's being trained in the family trade, and in 20 years she'll be able to make these vessels without thinking, the way you type without looking at the keyboard or drive without remembering the turns. The knowledge passes from hand to hand, generation to generation, written nowhere but preserved in muscle and memory. You wonder how many generations it took to get this good. You wonder how many more would come after. Historians still argue whether the potters of the Indus Valley were independent artisans or worked for some central authority, but watching them now you lean toward independent. There's too much variation in their styles, too many personal flourishes on otherwise standard forms. One potter incisors a simple geometric pattern around the shoulder of her jar before setting it aside. Another adds a small animal figurine to the lid of a storage vessel. A bull, you think, or maybe a zebu with its characteristic hump. These aren't mass-produced goods in the modern sense. They're handmade objects infused with the personalities of their makers, and you realize that somewhere in this city there's a house where someone will open a cupboard and recognize their grandmother's touch in every single pot. You wander through the courtyard, careful not to get in anyone's way, and you come to a low structure at the far end, the kill. It's a domed affair built of brick and clay, with openings at the bottom for feeding fuel and a chimney at the top that's still warm from the last firing. You crouch down and peer inside through one of the stoke holes, and you can see the remains of the previous batch. Potsherds and wasters, the ones that didn't survive the heat, their surfaces blistered and cracked where the temperature got too high or too low. The potters sift through these discards later, salvaging what they can, grinding down the failures to use as temper in new clay. Nothing wasted. Nothing thrown away. In the Indus Valley, even your mistakes get another chance. You stand up and look back at the wheels, still spinning, still producing, and you think about how this scene would look familiar to potters anywhere in the world, in any century. The same motions, the same tools, the same frustrations when a vessel collapses on the wheel or cracks in the drying. You've never thrown a pot yourself, but you imagine it must be one of those skills that looks easy until you try it, until you realize that your hands have never truly listened to you before, that they have minds of their own and those minds are not interested in symmetry. The potters here make it look effortless because for them it is effortless. They've been doing this since they could walk, since before they could walk, since their mothers held them on their hips while working the wheel. A man nearby is applying a red slip to dried vessels, painting them with a mixture of fine clay and mineral pigments that will fire to a deep terracotta. He works quickly, almost carelessly, and yet every vessel gets the same even coating, the same careful attention to the rim and base. Later, some of these will be painted with black designs, fish scales, intersecting circles, peacocks, using a brush made from a single hair, probably from a goat or a camel. The black pigment comes from a secret recipe, manganese perhaps, ground fine and mixed with just the right amount of water to flow smoothly without running. You want to ask him what's in it, but he's 5,000 years away and you're not sure he'd tell you anyway. Some secrets are worth keeping. You reach out and touch a freshly made cup, still damp, and you leave a fingerprint in the clay. No one notices, or if they do, they don't care. In 5,000 years, some archaeologist will find this cup and wonder about that fingerprint, will photograph it and write papers about it, will try to determine whether it belonged to the potter or the potter's customer or some random time traveler who couldn't keep his hands to himself. You smile at the thought and wipe the print away, leaving the cup smooth again, anonymous again, ready to be filled with whatever 5,000-year-old people drank in the morning. Water. Probably. Beer. Maybe. The same things you drink now, just served in a different cup. The wheels keep spinning. The clay keeps turning. And you realize you could watch this forever, this ancient dance of hands and earth, this moment when raw material becomes useful object, when mud becomes civilization. But you can't stay forever. There's more city to see, more wheels to hear, more clay to touch. You step back from the courtyard and let the sounds fade behind you, carrying with you the memory of hands that moved like water, shaping the world one vessel at a time. The smell of barley hits you before you see the granary, a warm, dusty scent that somehow survived 5,000 years of burial. You follow your nose through a series of narrow lanes, past houses where women sit in doorways grinding grain on stone saddles, their rhythmic scraping a counterpoint to the pottery wheels you left behind. The grain itself is invisible, long since turned to dust or eaten by rats or simply returned to the earth that grew it, but the smell lingers in your imagination, carried on the memory of harvest stacked higher than your head. You round a final corner and there it is, the great granary of Mohenjo-daro, a massive structure raised on a brick platform to keep it dry during floods, its walls still standing after all these years. You walk up the ramp that leads to the loading dock, your footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The granary is empty now, just a series of narrow bays arranged in rows, their floors raised on sleeper walls to allow air to circulate beneath the grain. You step into one of the bays and look up at the walls, still straight, still true, still doing their job even though there's nothing left to protect. You imagine this place at harvest time, bustling with workers carrying sacks of barley and wheat, their voices raised above the rustle of grain pouring from baskets into storage. The sound would have been like heavy rain, that pouring, a steady drumbeat of sustenance being laid away against the lean months to come. You run your hand along the brickwork and feel the precision of it, the way every brick fits exactly against its neighbors, creating a surface so smooth that rats would have had nothing to grip. The Harappans knew their enemies, and the enemies were not other cities or invading armies. The enemies were damp and rot and the small, hungry mouths of pests. They built against these enemies with the same care they brought to everything else, measuring twice and cutting once, making sure that the grain that fed their families would still be there when they needed it. You wonder if they ever thought about the people who would come after, the ones who would walk through these empty bays and try to imagine the weight of all that food, the security of all those full bellies. A woman appears in the doorway of the bay, a ghost woman with a basket balanced on her head, and she walks past you without seeing you. She's young, maybe 20, with strong shoulders and arms that speak of a lifetime of carrying things. She sets down her basket and begins to scoop the grain into a smaller container, measuring it out in portions that you can't quite follow. She's not alone for long. Other women join her, and soon the bay is filled with the sound of grain moving, of voices chatting, of the occasional laugh when someone's basket tips or someone else makes a joke you'll never hear. You step back against the wall and watch them work, these grandmothers of a civilization that left no names behind, and you realize that history has never been fair to people like them. The kings get the monuments. The warriors get the songs. The women who measured out the barley, who kept the children fed, who held everything together while the men did whatever men were doing, they get nothing. They get forgotten. But not here. Not in the Indus Valley. Because here, in this granary, you can't forget them. They're everywhere, in every basket, in every grain of barley that once passed through these hands. Historians still argue about whether the granaries were controlled by a central authority or operated collectively by the community. But watching these women work, you suspect the answer is more complicated than either option. They're not slaves, not servants, not employees. They're just people doing what needs to be done, the way people have always done, the way your own grandmother did before refrigerators and supermarkets made granaries obsolete. You step out of the bay and walk along the central aisle, peering into each storage compartment as you pass. Some are smaller than others. Some show signs of repair where the walls were reinforced after a flood or a collapse. You notice that the brickwork changes slightly in places, different shades of clay suggesting different construction periods, different generations adding their own touches to the structure their ancestors built. This granary wasn't built all at once and left alone. It grew and changed over centuries, adapted to new needs and new challenges, just like the city around it. Just like the people who used it. At the far end of the granary, you find a smaller room, separate from the main storage bays, and you step inside. This might have been an office, you think, or a place where records were kept. Though if there were records, they were written on something perishable, something that didn't survive the millennia. You imagine a scribe sitting here, cross-legged on the floor, making marks on a clay tablet or a piece of cloth, tracking how much grain came in and how much went out. The scribe would have known things nobody else knew, who had plenty, who was running low, which families might need help before the next harvest. The scribe would have held the city's secrets in their hands, and now those secrets are gone, carried away by time like grain scattered by the wind. You sit down on the floor of the little room, your back against the cool brick, and you close your eyes. You can still smell the barley, faint but persistent, and you can hear the women's voices if you listen hard enough. They're talking about children, probably. About husbands who don't help enough. About mothers-in-law who help too much. About the price of sesame oil and whether the well in their neighborhood is running low. The same conversations women have always had, in every language, in every century. You sit there for a long time, listening to voices that aren't there, smelling grain that turned to dust before your grandparents were born. When you finally open your eyes and stand up, the room is empty again, just bricks and shadows and the memory of work. You walk back through the granary, past the empty bays, down the ramp to the street below. Behind you, the women keep measuring, keep talking, keep holding their civilization together one basket at a time. They don't know you were there. They don't know anyone will ever wonder about them. They just keep working, because that's what you do when you're the ones who make sure everybody eats. You keep working, and you hope somebody notices. And 5,000 years later, sitting in the dark with your eyes closed and your ears straining, somebody finally does. You leave the granary and wander without purpose, letting your feet carry you where they will through the maze of lanes and alleys. The sun has climbed higher now, and the shadows have shortened, and the city hums with the activity of midday. Cooks preparing meals, merchant haggling over prices, children doing whatever children do when they think no one's watching. You turn down a narrow lane that looks no different from any other, and you nearly step on something small and fragile half buried in the dust. You stop, crouch down, and brush away the dirt with your fingers, and what emerges makes you catch your breath. It's a toy. A tiny clay cart, no bigger than your hand, with 4 wheels that still turn on their axles after 5,000 years. You lift it carefully, cradling it in your palm, and you marvel at the workmanship, the careful shaping of the cart bed, the holes drilled for the axles, the little ridges that might represent the planks of a real cart. You turn a wheel with your thumb and it spins freely, silently, as if it were made yesterday instead of millennia ago. Some child played with this, you realize. Some child pushed this cart through the dust of these very streets, making truck sounds long before trucks existed, imagining journeys to places they'd never see. You look around and suddenly you see them everywhere. Tiny animals, little dolls, miniature furniture, all scattered in the dust where children dropped them and never came back. There's a clay ball with a bell around its neck, a rattle that still makes a sound when you shake it, a board game with counters that might have been for something like backgammon. You pick up a small wheeled animal, a zebu probably, its legs broken off at some point in the distant past, and you wonder whether the child who owned it cried when it broke or just shrugged and found something else to play with. Probably shrugged. You decide. Kids are resilient. They've always been resilient. You sit down in the lane, right there in the dust, and you spread the toys out around you like an archaeologist cataloguing a find. There's a little cart with a driver, the driver's head missing but his arms still raised as if holding reins. There's a bird on wheels, a peacock maybe, its tail painted in black lines that have mostly faded. There's a tiny jar, no bigger than your thumbnail, that might have held pretend grain or pretend water or just the imagination of a child who was practicing to be a grown-up. You pick up each one in turn, turning it over in your hands, looking for fingerprints, for signs of wear, for anything that might tell you about the child who owned it. But the toys keep their secrets. They just sit there in your palm, mute and patient, waiting for a child who will never come back. Historians still argue whether the Indus Valley children had formal education or learned entirely through play and observation, but these toys suggest the answer might be both. The little carts are exact miniatures of the real carts that carried goods through the city streets. The animals are the same animals children saw every day: zebu, water buffalo, elephants, monkeys. The dolls wear the same clothing, have the same hairstyles, carry the same pots. Children were learning. You realize. They were learning through play, absorbing the world around them by recreating it in miniature, practicing the motions they'd need as adults by moving tiny wheels and tiny figures through tiny houses. You close your eyes and you can hear them, the ghost children of Mohenjo-daro, their laughter echoing off the brick walls as they chase each other through the lanes. You hear the rattle of a toy cart being dragged over rough ground, the argument over whose turn it is with the best doll, the sudden silence when someone's mother calls them home for a meal you can't smell. You open your eyes and the lane is empty, just dust and shadows and the toys lying where they fell, and you feel something tight in your chest that might be sadness or might be wonder or might be both at once. You pick up one last toy, a small clay monkey with articulated limbs that would have moved on strings, and you wonder who made it. Was it a parent, carving a gift for their child in the evening after work? Was it a professional toy maker, selling his wares in the market alongside the pots and the beads and the bronze tools? Was it the child themselves, learning to work with clay by making something simple and joyful? You'll never know, and that's the thing about archaeology. The more you find, the more questions you have, until you're buried under them like the city itself was buried under centuries of dust. You stand up, brushing off your clothes, and you look at the toys scattered at your feet. You can't take them with you, They belong here, in this lane, in this city, waiting for the children who dropped them. But you can carry the memory of them, the image of those tiny wheels and those painted eyes, the knowledge that children 5,000 years ago played exactly the way children play now. They ran and shouted and broke their toys and cried and laughed and grew up to be adults who made more toys for more children who would do the same. The cycle continues, has always continued, will always continue, and you're just one small part of it standing in a lane in a dead city, holding a clay monkey that should have crumbled to dust long ago but somehow didn't. You put the monkey back where you found it, careful to leave it exactly as it was, and you walk away without looking back. Behind you, the toys lie in the dust, waiting for children who will never come, waiting for archaeologists who haven't been born yet, waiting for you to forget them so they can surprise someone else 5,000 years from now. You hope someone finds them. You hope someone wonders. You hope that in 5,000 years, some other time traveler sits in this same lane and feels the same tightness in their chest and finally knows, that they weren't the first to feel it. You leave the lane of toys behind and find yourself walking toward what passes for the commercial district, your feet guided by the increasing density of doorways that open directly onto the street. Shops, you realize, places where goods were made and sold and traded. The street widens here, accommodating the flow of customers and merchants, and you notice that many of the doorways have brick platforms built into their thresholds, display counters where merchants would have laid out their wares for passers-by to examine. You stop at one such doorway, drawn by something glinting in the shadow, and you step inside. The shop is small, barely larger than a closet, but every inch of wall space is lined with niches and shelves. And on those shelves, in those niches, sit hundreds of tiny square objects, each one no bigger than a postage stamp, each one carved with exquisite precision from a stone called steatite. You reach out and take one from its shelf, holding it up to the light, and you see what the Harappans saw when they looked at these objects, a unicorn. Or at least, what they called a unicorn, a bull-like creature with a single horn, standing before what looks like a ritual object, maybe an incense burner or a feeding trough. The carving is so fine, so detailed, that you can see individual hairs in the creature's manner, the careful articulation of its hooves, the precise curve of its horn. These are the Indus Valley seals, and you're holding one in your hand. You turn it over and look at the back, where a small knob protrudes, pierced with a hole for a cord. The owner would have worn this around their neck or wrist, carrying their signature with them everywhere they went, using it to stamp their mark into clay tags attached to goods being shipped or stored. You imagine a merchant handing over a bale of cloth, then pressing this seal into a lump of wet clay to certify that the cloth was his, that he stood behind its quality, that if anything went wrong you'd know who to blame. The seal was a signature, a brand, an ID card, all in one tiny carved stone. You look more closely at the carving, at the row of symbols incised along the top of the seal. The Indus script, the great unsolved mystery of this civilization. You stare at those symbols, the fish-like shapes and the jar shapes and the geometric forms, and you will them to make sense, to resolve themselves into words you can understand. But they remain stubbornly silent, refusing to speak, keeping their secrets locked away for another century, another millennium, another forever. Historians still argue whether this script represents a language at all, whether the symbols are phonetic or logographic, whether we'll ever crack the code or whether it's gone forever, buried with the last person who knew how to read it. You run your thumb over the carved surface, feeling the ridges and valleys that some long-dead engraver cut into the stone with a copper tool and an unbelievably steady hand. How did they do this? You wonder. How did they cut these microscopic details into a stone that's barely harder than your fingernail? What kind of patience, what kind of skill, what kind of eyesight allowed them to create images that would outlast their entire civilization? You think about the engraver, sitting cross-legged in a shop like this one, hunched over a seal no bigger than your thumbnail, cutting line after line with a tool that must have been sharpened 100 times a day. He probably went blind eventually, or at least went bug-eyed, spending his whole life looking at things too small to see. You put the unicorn seal back on its shelf and pick up another, this one showing an elephant, its trunk raised in a gesture that might be greeting or might be warning. The carving is just as fine, just as detailed, and you notice that the elephant wears a cloth on its back, suggesting that these animals were tamed, trained, used for work or ceremony. Another seal shows a tiger, its stripes indicated by careful incisions, its mouth open in a snarl that still looks dangerous after all these years. Another shows a rhinoceros, its heavy armor rendered in loving detail, and you wonder if the engraver had ever seen one alive or worked from memory or imagination or the descriptions of hunters who came back with stories. You spend an hour in that tiny shop, maybe longer, picking up seal after seal and holding them to the light. You see zebu with their characteristic humps, crocodiles basking on riverbanks, fish swimming in stylized schools. You see geometric patterns so complex they make your head hurt, and you see the script, always the script, those silent symbols that appear on almost every seal but never seem to tell the same story twice. Some seals have only a handful of symbols, others have rows of them marching across the top of the image, and you wonder if they're names, titles, prayers, receipts, or something nobody has even thought of yet. You come to a seal that shows a figure seated in a yoga pose, surrounded by animals, wearing a horned headdress and what might be multiple faces. Some scholars call this figure a proto-Shiva, an early version of the Hindu god, but others say that's reading too much into too little evidence. You look at the figure, at its calm posture and commanding presence, and you feel like it's looking back at you, waiting for you to understand something you're not quite ready to grasp. You put the seal down carefully, respectfully, and you step back from the shelf. Outside, the street continues to hum with ghostly commerce, merchants you can't quite see calling out prices you can't quite hear. You step out of the shop and rejoin the flow of traffic, your mind still full of unicorns and elephants and symbols that won't speak. Behind you, the seals sit on their shelves, waiting for the merchants who wore them, waiting for the goods they certified, waiting for someone to come along who can finally read what they have to say. You hope that someone comes soon. You hope they come before the seals crumble to dust, before the last chance to understand disappears forever. But as you walk away, you have a feeling that the seals will wait. They've waited this long. They can wait a little longer. The street opens into what might be a marketplace, though it's hard to tell where one shop ends and another begins. You push through crowds of ghost shoppers, their baskets brushing against you as they pass, and you find yourself drawn to a particular doorway where the light catches something brilliant, red, deep, and warm, the color of dried blood or desert sunsets. You step inside and your breath catches, because you've never seen so many beads in one place. They hang from the ceiling in strings, they spill from baskets on the floor, they lie in neat piles on workbenches waiting to be sorted. Carnelian, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, steatite, shell, copper, faience. Every color you can name and some you can't. Every shape from simple rounds to complex facete forms that must have taken days to grind. You're in a bead maker's workshop, and the air here is thick with the dust of ground stone. You cough, though you don't need to, and you watch as a craftsman sits cross-legged on the floor, his lap covered with a leather apron, a small bow drill in his hands. He's drilling holes in carnelian beads, the hardest stone these people worked with, and he does it by spinning a drill made of copper or jasper against the surface, using fine abrasive sand to grind his way through. It takes hours to drill a single bead, sometimes days, and he has hundreds of them waiting in the basket beside him. You watch the patience of it, the steady rhythm of the bow moving back and forth, the way he checks his progress every few minutes by holding the bead up to the light. He'll be doing this for the rest of his life, you realize. He'll drill beads until his hands give out, and then his children will take over, and their children after that. Generation after generation of people whose entire existence was spent making tiny holes in tiny stones. You pick up a finished bead from the pile, a carnelian cylinder about the length of your fingernail, and you hold it to the light. The stone is translucent, glowing from within like a coal that's almost but not quite on fire. The Harappans had a trick for carnelian, you remember. They could heat it to turn the brownish stone into that deep, fiery red, a process that required careful control of temperature and timing. Too hot and the stone cracks. Too cool and the color doesn't take. Just right and you get beads that would travel thousands of miles, that would end up in the tombs of Mesopotamian kings, that would be treasured and traded and buried with their owners as the most valuable things they owned. You look around the workshop and you see evidence of that trade everywhere. There's lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, its deep blue flecked with gold, mined in mountains 1,000 miles away and carried here by traders who crossed deserts and rivers to bring it. There's turquoise from Iran, maybe, or from Central Asia, its greenish blue a sharp contrast to the carnelian's fire. There's jade from who knows where, and amber that might have come from the Baltic, and shells from the Indian Ocean that still hold the memory of salt water. This little workshop in Mohenjo-daro was connected to half the known world, a node in a network that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas, and all of it came together here, in this dusty room, to be turned into beads. Historians still argue about how this trade was organized, whether it was controlled by the state or run by independent merchants, whether the bead makers worked for themselves or for someone else, whether the goods moved through official channels or followed ancient pathways that nobody owned. You look at the craftsman with his bow drill, at the woman across the room sorting beads by color and size, at the children sweeping up the dust and carrying it away to be used as temper in pottery, and you suspect the answer is all of the above and none of the above. Trade in the Indus Valley was probably as complicated as trade anywhere. A mixture of family connections and long-term relationships and one-off deals and gifts and thefts and everything in between. You wander through the workshop, careful not to disturb the ghost workers who ignore you completely. In one corner, a woman is shaping rough lumps of stone into bead preforms, using a stone hammer and incredible patience to knock off flakes until she has something approaching the right shape. In another, a man is polishing finished beads on a stone slab, rubbing each one with fine abrasive until it gleams like glass. In a third, someone is stringing the finished beads onto threads, making necklaces and bracelets that will be sold in the market or traded to merchant heading west. The whole operation hums with purpose, every person doing one small thing in a long chain that ends with someone wearing beauty around their neck. You pick up a string of finished beads, lapis and carnelian alternating, and you hold it in your hands. The weight of it surprises you. Stone is heavier than it looks, and the colors sing together in a way that makes you wish you could take it home. But you can't, of course. It doesn't belong to you, and even if it did, you're not really here, and neither are the beads, not anymore. They're in a museum somewhere, probably, or in a storage box in some university basement, or maybe they've been stolen and sold to a collector who keeps them in a safe and never shows them to anyone. You put the necklace back where you found it, carefully, reverently, and you step away. A child runs past you, a ghost child with a string of beads in her hand, and she's laughing about something you'll never understand. She disappears through a doorway and you hear her voice fade into the general murmur of the city. You think about where those beads might go, the ones she's carrying. Maybe she'll wear them herself, or give them to her mother, or trade them to a friend for something she wants more. Maybe they'll end up in a grave with her when she dies, or be passed down to her own children, or be lost in the street where some archaeologist will find them 5,000 years later and wonder who she was. You hope someone wonders. You hope someone picks up those beads and thinks about the girl who carried them, the way you're thinking about her now. You step out of the workshop and back into the market, the dust of ground stone still tickling your nose. The sun has moved while you were inside, the shadows longer now, the light softer. You have the feeling you could spend years in this city and never see everything, could spend a lifetime just in this one workshop watching beads being made and traded and worn. But you can't stay. There's more to see, more to learn, more to wonder about. You walk on, the sound of the bow drill fading behind you, the glint of carnelian still burning in your memory. Your bladder reminds you that you're human, which in a city like Mohenjo-daro is not the problem it would be almost anywhere else in the ancient world. You look around for a public facility, and within minutes you find one. A small brick structure tucked between two houses, its entrance marked by nothing more than a worn threshold. You step inside and find yourself in a room that would be unremarkable except for what sits against the far wall. A brick platform with a hole in it, leading to a drain that disappears into the wall. You're looking at the world's oldest known toilet, and you have to admit it looks more comfortable than some you've used in modern airports. You sit down, because when in Rome, or when in Mohenjo-daro, and you marvel at the engineering that makes this possible. The drain slopes gently downward, carrying waste away from the city and into a covered channel that eventually empties into the river or into a soak pit far from residential areas. The whole system relies on gravity and careful planning, on the understanding that what you don't want in your house you also don't want in your neighbor's house, on the simple but revolutionary idea that sanitation is a public good, not a private luxury. You're sitting 5,000 years in the past, doing something that people in much more recent centuries would have done in chamber pots or open streets, and you feel a strange pride in these ancient plumbers who figured it out so early. You finish your business and stand up, looking more closely at the toilet's construction. The bricks are worn smooth from centuries of use, their edges rounded by countless backsides that came before yours. The hole itself is carefully shaped, flared at the top for comfort, and the platform slopes slightly toward it so that water poured for cleaning would flow where it needed to go. You notice that the mortar between the bricks is still intact, still doing its job after all these years, and you wonder what kind of mix they used, what recipe allowed it to survive when so many modern buildings crumble after decades. You step out of the toilet and find yourself in a small courtyard shared by several houses, and here the sanitation system becomes even more visible. A covered drain runs along one wall, its inspection holes placed at regular intervals so that blockages could be cleared without tearing up the street. You crouch down and lift one of the covers, a stone slab with a finger hole carved into it, and you peer into the darkness below. The channel is wide enough for a person to crawl through, its sides plastered smooth to prevent anything from catching, its floor sloping steadily toward the main drain. You imagine the workers whose job it was to maintain this system, crawling through these tunnels with lamps and scrapers, keeping the city clean so that everyone else could pretend waste just disappeared on its own. Historians still argue about who built and maintained these drains, whether they were the responsibility of individual households, or neighborhood associations, or some central authority. You look at the inspection holes, at the careful construction, at the way the system connects house after house after house, and you suspect it was a combination of all three. The people who lived here knew that their health depended on their neighbor's health, that your drain emptying into my courtyard helped nobody, that the only way to make sanitation work was to work together. It's a lesson we've forgotten and relearned and forgotten again. A lesson written in brick and plaster 5,000 years ago that we're still struggling to read. You walk through the courtyard and into one of the houses, following the drain line to see where it leads. Inside, you find a bathroom almost identical to the public toilet you just used. A brick platform with a hole, a sloping floor, a drain opening in the wall. But this one is more elaborate, its platform decorated with a border of carved brick, its walls plastered and painted with faded patterns that might have been flowers or might have been something else entirely. The people who lived here were proud of their bathroom. You realize. They showed it off, made it beautiful, treated it as a normal part of daily life rather than something to be hidden away and embarrassed about. You sit on the edge of the platform, carefully, because you don't want to break anything, and you try to imagine what bath time was like in this house. A servant would have brought water from the well, heated it if necessary, poured it over the bather who sat on this very platform. The water would have flowed across the floor, carrying away soap and dirt, disappearing into the drain and out of the house forever. No carrying slops to the street, no throwing waste out windows, no wading through filth to get to the market. Just clean, efficient, dignified sanitation that wouldn't be matched in most of the world until the 19th century. You think about what these people would make of modern sanitation, the flushing toilets, the sewer systems, the water treatment plants. They'd probably be impressed, but they might also be a little confused about why it took us so long to figure it out. They'd look at our cities, at the places where people still don't have clean water or working toilets, and they'd wonder what went wrong. They'd look at our rivers, polluted with everything we try to flush away, and they'd wonder why we forgot that what goes around comes around, that the water you poison today is the water you drink tomorrow. You stand up and leave the bathroom, walking back through the house and out into the courtyard. The drain still runs along the wall, still waiting for water that will never come, still doing its job even though there's no job left to do. You follow it out of the courtyard and into the street, where it joins the main drain and disappears toward the city wall. Somewhere out there, beyond the houses and the markets and the workshops, that drain empties into the river, carrying the city's waste away to be diluted and dispersed and forgotten. The river doesn't mind. The river has been carrying away waste since before there were cities to produce it, since before there were people to produce it, since before there was anything at all except water and rock and the slow work of geology. You walk on, leaving the drains behind, but you carry with you a new respect for the people who built them. They weren't kings or warriors or priests. They were plumbers, basically, and they changed the world more than any conqueror ever did. They made it possible for people to live together without dying together, to build cities without building epidemics, to create civilization without creating cesspools. You hope someone remembers them. You hope someone gives them the credit they deserve. But you know, even as you hope it, that nobody will. The plumbers never get the credit. They just keep working, keep cleaning, keep making it possible for the rest of us to pretend we don't need them. You're walking through a residential district on the eastern edge of the city when the character of the streets changes. The houses here are smaller, more crowded together, and the usual bustle of daily life is absent. You round a corner and stop dead, because what lies before you is not a street anymore. It's a room, or what used to be a room, its walls collapsed inward, its floor littered with things that make your stomach turn. Skeletons. Dozens of them, sprawled where they fell, their bones bleaching in a sun that stopped shining on them years ago. You step closer, drawn by a macabre curiosity you can't quite control, and you kneel beside the nearest skeleton. It's a woman, you think, based on the size of the bones and the fragments of jewelry still scattered around her neck, carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, the remains of a copper bangle on her wrist. She lies on her side, curled slightly, as if she fell asleep and never woke up. But the position is wrong for sleep, too twisted, too sudden. You look closer and you see it, a crack in her skull, a depression fracture that probably killed her instantly. She didn't fall asleep. She was struck down, here, in this room, and she never got up again. You stand up and look around, and suddenly you see them everywhere. Skeletons in doorways, skeletons in courtyards, skeletons huddled together in groups as if they died trying to protect each other. Some show signs of violence, cut marks on bones or crushing injuries to skulls. Others seem untouched, their bones clean and whole, as if they died of something less visible. Disease, perhaps, or starvation, or simple terror. You walk through the room, stepping carefully between the dead, and you try to piece together what happened here. The standard story, the one you've heard since you were old enough to care about such things, is that the Indus Valley Civilization was destroyed by invading Aryans, nomadic warriors from the north who swept through and conquered everyone in their path. But standing here, surrounded by these bones, you're not so sure. Historians still argue about what killed these people, and about whether they're evidence of a massacre or something else entirely. The skeletons were found in the 1920s, during the first excavations of Mohenjo-daro, and they've been at the center of a debate ever since. Some scholars see them as proof of violent conquest, the last stand of a civilization that couldn't defend itself against better armed invaders. Others point out that the skeletons are few in number, only a few dozen in a city of 40,000, and that they show no signs of the kind of wholesale slaughter you'd expect from a conquest. Maybe they were victims of an epidemic, buried in a hurry and then forgotten. Maybe they died in a riot or a civil conflict. Maybe they're not evidence of the city's end at all, just a small tragedy in a long history of small tragedies. You kneel beside another skeleton, this one a child, its small bones almost lost among the adults surrounding it. You can't tell whether it's a boy or a girl, can't tell anything about its life except that it ended here, in this room, surrounded by people who probably loved it. You wonder if they tried to protect it, if they gathered around it when the danger came, if its last moments were spent in the arms of someone who would have died 1,000 times to save it. And then you wonder if that's what happened, if love is any protection against violence, if anyone ever died happier because they weren't alone. You stand up and walk to the doorway, looking out at the street beyond. More skeletons here, lying in the lane where they fell. A group of 3, maybe a family, their bones entangled in a way that suggests they died together. A single skeleton further on, sprawled on its back, its arms flung out as if reaching for something. You follow the trail of bones through the streets, past houses that show no other signs of destruction, past wells that still hold water and drains that still work and walls that still stand straight and true. If this was a conquest, you think, it was a strange one. The conquerors killed these people and then just left? Didn't loot the houses, didn't burn the city, didn't move in and take over? It doesn't make sense. You come to a larger group, a dozen skeletons piled in what might have been a communal grave. They're not arranged neatly, not buried with care, just thrown together and left, their bones mingling in ways that make it impossible to tell where one person ends and another begins. You count the skulls you can see. 7, 8, 9. The rest are hidden beneath the pile, their faces turned away from you, their secrets buried deeper than any archaeologist can reach. You wonder who they were, these 9 people and the ones beneath them. Were they the last survivors, huddled together when the end came? Were they the first victims, killed and then covered by others who died later? Were they killed by invaders, or by disease, or by each other? You sit down on a fallen brick, suddenly exhausted, and you let the weight of what you're seeing settle over you. You've been walking through this city for hours, maybe days, marveling at its sophistication and beauty and humanity. And now you've found its death, its end, its final moments frozen in bone and brick. This is what happens to civilizations. You think. They don't last forever. They rise and they fall and they're forgotten. And 5,000 years later someone sits among their bones and tries to understand what went wrong. But as you sit there, looking at the skeletons, you realize something else. These aren't the only dead in Mohenjo-daro. They're just the ones who weren't buried properly, the ones who were left where they fell. All those other people you've been walking among, the potters and merchants and grandmothers and children, they're dead too, every single one of them. The difference is that they were buried, or cremated, or otherwise disposed of in ways that left no trace. They had people who cared for them after death, people who performed whatever rituals their culture required, people who made sure they didn't end up like this, sprawled in the street for strangers to find. You stand up and take one last look at the skeletons, these unlucky few who became the face of a civilization's end. Then you turn and walk away, back toward the living city, back toward the pottery wheels and the market calls and the children playing in the dust. You know now what you're walking toward, what waits at the end of this journey, but for now you push it aside and keep going. There's more to see, more to learn, more to wonder about. The dead will still be here when you come back. They're not going anywhere. You leave the skeletons behind and walk toward the river, needing to feel water moving, needing to see something that isn't dead. The streets slope gently downward as you approach the city's edge, and soon you're standing on the brick embankment that separates Mohenjo-daro from the Indus River. The water spreads out before you, brown and wide and lazy, carrying silt from mountains you'll never see toward an ocean you'll never reach. You sit on the edge of the embankment, your feet dangling over the water that isn't there anymore, and you watch the river that made all of this possible. The Indus is the reason this city exists. Its annual floods brought fresh silt that kept the fields fertile. Its water filled the wells and the Great Bath and the drains. Its fish fed the people and its reeds provided material for baskets and boats. The Harappans didn't just live near the river, they lived with it, adapting to its rhythms, building their cities to withstand its floods and take advantage of its gifts. You look upstream and imagine the water rising in spring, fed by snowmelt in the Himalayas, spreading across the floodplain and leaving behind the rich soil that grew the barley and wheat you saw in the granary. You look downstream and imagine the boats that carried trade goods to the coast, to the ports where merchants from distant lands waited to exchange their goods for carnelian beads and cotton cloth. But rivers are not faithful lovers. They change course, shift their beds, abandon the cities that depended on them. And that, you realize, is what you're really here to see. You stand up and walk along the embankment, following the river's edge, and you notice something strange. The water is further away than it should be. The embankment now separated from the actual river by a wide strip of land that was once underwater. You keep walking, and the strip gets wider, and soon you realize that the river has moved. It's shifted to the east, over centuries, slowly abandoning the city that grew up on its banks. You're walking on dry land that used to be riverbed, and ahead of you, the real Indus flows where there used to be fields and villages and maybe other cities that we'll never find. Historians still argue about how much this shift contributed to the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization. Some say it was the primary cause, that when the river moved, the agriculture that supported the cities collapsed, and the people had no choice but to leave. Others point out that the shift was gradual, happening over centuries, and that the Harappans would have had time to adapt, digging new canals, moving their fields, adjusting to the new reality. But you stand here, watching the river flow where it shouldn't be, and you wonder if adaptation is always possible. You wonder if there comes a point when the ground beneath your feet is no longer the ground you chose, when the water that gave you life becomes the water that takes it away. You walk out onto the dry riverbed, your feet sinking slightly into the silt that hasn't completely hardened. The surface is cracked into polygons, dried mud that once swirled with currents and sheltered fish and carried boats. You crouch down and pick up a piece of it, a dried curl of river bottom, and you crumble it between your fingers. It falls away like dust, like memory, like everything that water touches eventually. This riverbed was alive once, full of motion and sound and the glint of sunlight on moving water. Now it's dead as the city behind you, waiting for the next flood that might never come. You look back at Mohenjo-daro, its walls still standing against the sky, and you try to see it through the eyes of someone watching the river retreat. At first, it wouldn't have been a problem. The water was still close enough to reach, still close enough to irrigate the fields. But year by year, decade by decade, the distance grew. The canals had to be extended, then extended again. The fields that once flooded naturally now had to be watered by hand. The boats that once docked at the city's edge now had to be unloaded further and further away, their goods carried overland by ox carts that added time and cost to every journey. It wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have happened so slowly that nobody noticed until it was too late. You think about what that would feel like, watching your world slowly become uninhabitable. Not a sudden disaster, not a war or a flood or a plague, but a gradual decline that you couldn't point to, couldn't fight, couldn't blame on anyone. The river just left. And when the river left, so did the reason for the city to exist. The fields grew less productive. The trade routes shifted. The young people started moving away, looking for better opportunities elsewhere. The old people stayed, because old people always stay, but eventually they died too, and then there was nobody left to remember why the city was built here in the first place. You walk back to the embankment and sit down again, this time facing the city instead of the river. The sun is lower now, the light softer, and the bricks of Mohenjo-daro glow warm in the late afternoon. You can hear the pottery wheels still turning, the market still humming, the children still playing. But you know now that it's all temporary, all doomed, all heading toward the same end as every other civilization that ever existed. The river will leave, and the city will die, and the people will scatter, and 5,000 years later you'll sit here wondering what it felt like to be the last person to leave, the last one to lock the door and walk away from everything you ever knew. You close your eyes and listen to the river that isn't there anymore, and you think you can hear it, just barely, a ghost sound carried on the wind. The Indus is still flowing, still doing what rivers do, but it's not flowing here anymore. It's over there, to the east, where you can't see it but you know it's there, carrying water from the mountains to the sea, carrying silt that could have fed these fields, carrying the memory of a city that once depended on it. The river doesn't care. Rivers never care. They just flow, and the cities that grow up on their banks are just accidents, temporary arrangements, brief interruptions in the long conversation between water and stone. You open your eyes and stand up, brushing the dust from your clothes. The city waits behind you, full of life and death and everything in between. The river flows somewhere to the east, doing what it's always done. And you walk back toward the gates, carrying with you the knowledge that even rivers can leave, even civilizations can end, even the things that seem permanent are just passing through. You walk on, and behind you, the river keeps flowing, and the city keeps waiting, and the cycle continues whether you're there to see it or not. You walk back through the city gates and everything looks the same, but you see it differently now. The houses, the workshops, the markets, the baths, they're still here, still humming with ghostly life, but you know what's coming. You know the river will leave and the people will follow, and all of this will become nothing but bricks and bones and the occasional toy cart waiting for a child who never comes back. But as you walk, you start noticing something you missed before, something that becomes more obvious with every step. There are no palaces here. No temples. No royal tombs or monuments to great leaders. You're walking through one of the largest cities of the ancient world, and you can't find a single building that screams, "Look at me, I'm important." You stop in the middle of a wide intersection and spin slowly, taking it all in. The houses are all roughly the same size, give or take. The workshops are scattered throughout the residential areas instead of being segregated into an industrial district. The public buildings, the Great Bath, the granaries, the assembly halls, are impressive, but they're not set apart on acropolises or surrounded by walls. Everything is mixed together, rich and poor, sacred and secular, public and private, in a way that feels almost modern and almost alien at the same time. You're standing in a city with no obvious center, no obvious hierarchy, no obvious rulers. You walk to one of the larger houses, the kind that archaeologists sometimes call elite residences because they're bigger than average and have more elaborate brickwork. You step through the entrance and into the courtyard, and you look around for signs of luxury, gold, silver, imported luxuries, anything that would mark the occupants as special. You find better bathrooms, sure. You find more storage space, more rooms, more careful plastering. But you don't find thrones or crowns or scepters or any of the things that kings surround themselves with. You don't find evidence that anyone here could tell anyone else what to do. Historians still argue about how the Indus Valley was governed. Some say there must have been rulers, priests, a central authority. How else could you coordinate the construction of cities, the standardization of bricks, the organization of trade? Others look at the same evidence and see a society without rulers, without hierarchy, without the kind of top-down control that we assume is necessary for civilization. Maybe they were governed by councils of elders, or by consensus, or by some system we can't even imagine because we're so trapped in our own assumptions about how power works. You stand in this empty courtyard, surrounded by the ghosts of people who lived without kings, and you try to wrap your mind around what that would feel like. You think about your own life, your own society, the way power flows through it in ways you barely notice. The politicians, the bosses, the landlords, the people who can say yes or no to your dreams. You've never known a world without them. Never imagined that civilization could exist without someone at the top telling everyone else what to do. But here, in this city, it seems like that's exactly what happened. The people built their houses the same size because nobody could build a bigger one. They made decisions collectively because nobody had the power to decide alone. They lived together for centuries without leaving behind a single image of a king, a single royal tomb, a single monument to individual greatness. You leave the house and walk through the streets, looking at the people around you with new eyes. The potter at her wheel, the merchant in his shop, the woman carrying water from the well, none of them have anyone above them. None of them bow or scrape or defer. They just go about their business, doing what needs to be done, because that's what people do when nobody's telling them otherwise. You watch a group of men unloading a cart of grain, and you notice that nobody's giving orders. They just work together, each one knowing what to do, each one pulling their weight without needing to be supervised. It's beautiful, in a way. It's terrifying, in another way. You're not sure which. You think about what would happen if you tried to run a modern city this way. No mayor, no police chief, no city council, no zoning board. Just people, figuring it out as they go along, making decisions by consensus and hoping for the best. It sounds like chaos. It sounds like the kind of thing that would fall apart in a week, maybe a day, maybe an hour. But here, in Mohenjo-daro, it worked for 700 years. 700 years without kings, without armies, without anyone telling anyone else what to do. That's longer than most empires last. That's longer than any modern democracy has existed. That's longer than the United States has been a country, longer than most European nations have existed in their current form. You pass a group of children playing in the street, and you wonder what they're being taught about power. Probably nothing. You realize. Probably they're learning that everyone is the same, that nobody is born to rule and nobody is born to serve, that the world is what you make of it together. You watch a little girl help a smaller boy to his feet after he falls, and you see in that small gesture the whole philosophy of this place. You help because help is needed. You lead because leadership is required. You follow because following makes sense. Not because anyone tells you to, but because that's what people do when they're free. You walk on, and the city unfolds around you like a proof of concept, like evidence that another way of living is possible. No pyramids, no palaces, no pharaohs. Just bricks and drains and pottery wheels and people. Millions of people over 7 centuries, living and dying and raising children and growing old without ever once saluting a flag or bowing to a throne. You try to imagine what they'd make of your world, of your kings and presidents and CEOs, of your armies and police and prisons. Would they be impressed by your technology? Probably. Would they be horrified by your hierarchies? Almost certainly. The sun is getting lower now, the shadows longer, and you realize you've been walking for hours without really noticing. The city around you is starting to quiet down, the ghost people heading home for the evening, the pottery wheels falling silent one by one. You find a low wall and sit down, watching the light change, watching the bricks glow orange and then pink and then purple as the sun sinks toward the horizon. You think about kings and the people who need them, about rulers and the people who can't imagine living without them. And you think about this city, this impossible city, this proof that it doesn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that way. And maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to stay that way. You wake on that low wall, not remembering when you fell asleep, and the first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of night, the normal quiet of a sleeping city, but something deeper, something wrong. The pottery wheels have stopped. All of them. You listen harder, straining for any sound, a voice, an animal, a footstep, and you hear nothing. The city is empty. You stand up slowly, your joints complaining about the night spent on brick, and you look around. The street is empty. The houses are empty. The market stalls stand abandoned, their goods still laid out as if the merchants just stepped away for a moment, but you know they didn't. You know they're not coming back. You walk to the nearest house and step inside, and you find what you expected to find: nothing. The hearth is cold, the storage jars empty, the sleeping mat's gone. The people who lived here packed up and left, taking what they could carry, leaving behind the things that were too heavy or too precious to abandon. You walk through room after room, house after house, and the story is the same everywhere. This wasn't a sudden disaster. Not really. This was a gradual emptying, a slow leak of people over years or decades, until one day the last family loaded their last cart and walked away. You find things they left behind: a grinding stone too heavy to carry, a broken pot they meant to fix, a child's toy that got forgotten in the rush. You pick up the toy, a clay ball with a bell around its neck, and you wonder if the child cried when they realized it was missing. You wonder if the parents went back for it, or if they told the child they'd get another one in the new place, wherever the new place was. You step back into the street and walk toward the center of the city, and the silence follows you like a living thing. No birds. You realize. No dogs, no cattle, no rats even. The animals left too, or died, or were taken by the people who needed them. The city is truly empty, truly dead, and you're the only living thing in it. You walk past the great bath, its empty basin holding nothing but shadows. You walk past the granary, its storage bays echoing with the memory of grain. You walk past the potters' workshops, their wheels still, their kilns cold, their unfinished vessels sitting on benches where they'll sit forever. Historians still argue about why the Indus people left their cities. Some say climate change, the river shifting, the monsoon patterns altering until the land couldn't support them anymore. Some say overexploitation, deforestation, soil salinization from over-irrigation. Some say invasion, though the evidence for that is thin. Some say they just moved on, drifted east and south, merged with other cultures, became something new. You walk through these empty streets and you think maybe it was all of those things and none of them. Maybe the reasons were as complicated as people always are. Maybe the people themselves didn't fully understand why they were leaving until they were already gone. You come to a house that looks different from the others. Its doorway sealed with bricks. You stop and look at it, and you realize this must have been the last house, the final family, the people who stayed after everyone else had gone. They sealed their door when they left, a strange thing to do in an empty city, and you wonder why. Were they protecting something inside? Saying goodbye in their own way? Or just following a habit so deep they did it without thinking? Sealing the door the way they'd done every night of their lives, even though there was nobody left to seal it against? You don't break the seal. You leave it intact, a message from the last people to the first person who would come after, a gesture across 5,000 years that you're not sure how to interpret. You walk on, and the silence presses in around you, and you start to feel like you're the one who's dead, walking through a city of the living that you can't quite reach. The ghosts are gone. You realize. The people you've been walking among, the potters and merchants and grandmothers and children, they've left too, moved on to whatever came next, taking their ghosts with them. The city is empty of everything except bricks and dust and the memory of memory. You find yourself back at the river embankment, and you look out at the Indus, still flowing where it flows now, not where it used to. The city behind you is silent, empty, done. The people who built it are somewhere else, living different lives in different places, their children's children's children scattered across the subcontinent. They didn't die out. Not exactly. They just became something else. Merged with other cultures, adopted new gods, learned new ways. The Indus civilization didn't end so much as transform, dissolve, fade into the background of history until all that was left was bricks and seals and the soft clinking of pottery wheels that nobody could hear anymore. You sit on the embankment and watch the sun rise over the empty city. The light creeps across the bricks, warming them, bringing out the same colors they've had for 5,000 years. You think about the last person to leave, the one who locked the door and walked away without looking back. Did they know they were the last? Did they feel the weight of it, the finality, the knowledge that they were closing a chapter that would never be opened again? Or did they just think they were moving to a better place, a place with more water, better soil, kinder neighbors, and the city behind them was just a place they used to live, nothing more? You'll never know. Nobody will ever know. The last person took that knowledge with them, buried it somewhere in the east or south, mixed it into the soil of a new home where nobody asked about the old one. The silence stretches on, empty and complete, and you sit in it for a long time, listening to nothing, watching the light grow, feeling the weight of all those empty years pressing down on you like the bricks of 1,000 houses. The city is dead. Long live the city. You stand up from the embankment and walk back into the city one last time. But something has changed. The silence is still there, the emptiness still complete, but now you notice things you missed before. Signs that you're not the first to walk these streets since the people left. In the dust near a doorway, you see footprints, but not yours. They're smaller, more careful, and they lead to a spot where someone has dug a small trench, exposing a section of wall that had been buried for millennia. You follow the footprints and find more trenches, more holes, more places where the earth has been disturbed by people who came after, people who wanted to know what lay beneath. You're following the archaeologists now, the ones who found this place in the 1920s and have been digging ever since. You come to a large excavation, a grid of squares marked out with string, and you see them, ghost archaeologists, bending over their work, brushing dirt from potsherds and measuring walls and taking notes in ledgers that will end up in university libraries nobody visits. They work in the same silence that fills the rest of the city, their brushes making soft sounds against the earth, their voices low when they speak at all. You watch them for a while, these people from your own time, and you feel a strange kinship with them. They're trying to understand, just like you. They're trying to hear the voices that have gone silent, just like you. You walk to the edge of the excavation and look down into a trench that cuts through layers of history. Near the top, you see the remains of later occupations, squatters, probably, people who moved into the ruins long after the original inhabitants left. Below that, a layer of wind-blown dust, centuries of it, marking the time when the city sat empty and slowly crumbled. Below that, the real city, the Harappan city, its bricks still sharp and clean where the dirt has been removed. Layer after layer, like reading a book written in earth, each page telling a different story. Historians still argue about how much of the Indus Valley remains underground. Some say 90%, maybe more. The excavations so far have barely scratched the surface, uncovering only a fraction of what lies beneath. You look out across the landscape beyond the city walls, at the low mounds that stretch in every direction, and you realize that every one of those mounds is a tell, a buried city, a place where people lived and worked and died and were forgotten. Mohenjo-daro is just one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of Indus sites scattered across Pakistan and India. What you've seen today is less than 1% of what's there. Less than 1% of what's waiting to be found. You crouch down at the edge of an unexcavated area, a place where the ground looks like nothing special, just dirt and rocks and a few scattered sherds. But you know now that beneath this dirt, beneath your feet, there are walls and floors and hearths and toys and seals and all the other detritus of human life. There are houses where people loved and fought and raised children and grew old. There are workshops where artisans shaped stone and metal and clay into things of beauty and utility. There are streets where children ran and merchants called and the soft clinking of pottery wheels filled the air. All of it is still there, waiting. All of it is still underground, waiting for someone to uncover it, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. You reach down and pick up a small potsherd, just a fragment of a larger vessel, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. You turn it over in your hands, looking for anything that might tell you about the person who made it. A fingerprint, a scratch, a bit of pigment. There's nothing, just the curve of the vessel, the slight roughness of the clay, the weight of it in your palm. You hold it for a long moment, this tiny piece of a civilization, this fragment of a fragment, and then you put it back exactly where you found it. Let someone else find it, you think. Let someone else wonder. Let the next generation of archaeologists have their own moment of connection, their own piece of the past to hold and question and eventually put back. You stand up and look out at the mounds, at the unexcavated tells, at the 90% that nobody has touched yet. What's down there? More unicorn seals? Probably. More toys, more beads, more drains, more mysteries. Maybe a library, if they wrote on something perishable. Maybe a royal tomb, if they had kings after all. Maybe something nobody has even imagined, something that will rewrite everything we think we know about this civilization. It's all down there, waiting. It's all underground, waiting for someone to care enough to look. You think about the archaeologists who will come after the ones you're watching now, the ones who haven't been born yet, the ones who will bring new techniques and new questions and new ways of seeing. They'll find things these early excavators missed. They'll ask questions nobody thought to ask. They'll piece together stories from fragments that seem meaningless now. And someday, maybe, they'll understand this civilization the way we understand ancient Egypt or Rome or Greece. Someday, maybe, the Indus Valley will speak again, and we'll finally hear what it's been trying to tell us all along. But that's in the future. Right now, you're standing in the present, looking at the past, feeling the weight of everything that's still unknown. You crouch down one more time and press your palm against the earth, feeling the coolness of it, the solidity, the presence of all those buried lives just inches below your skin. You can't hear them. Not really. You can't feel them. Not truly. But you know they're there, and somehow that's enough. Somehow, knowing that they're waiting, that they'll be found someday, that someone will care about them eventually, that's enough to make the silence bearable. You stand up and step back from the trench, leaving the archaeologists to their work, leaving the city to its long sleep. The sun is high now, the day warming, and you have the feeling that your time here is coming to an end. One more walk, you think. One more look. One more chance to say goodbye to a place you never really knew. You take that last walk through the empty city, your feet carrying you along streets you've come to know like the back of your hand. Past the potters' workshops, their wheels still and cold. Past the bead makers' shops, the carnelian and lapis lazuli still waiting on their shelves. Past the great bath, its empty basin holding nothing but the memory of water and the reflection of a sky that's watched over this place for 5,000 years. You walk slowly, deliberately, trying to fix every detail in your memory. The way the light falls on the bricks, the texture of the plaster, the silence that fills every space where voices used to be. You come to the lane where you found the toys, and you crouch down to look at them one last time. The little clay cart with wheels that still turn. The bull with the bell around its neck. The monkey with articulated limbs that would have moved on strings. They're still here, still waiting, still hoping for children who will never come back. You pick up the cart and turn its wheels with your thumb, watching them spin, listening to the tiny sound they make against the axle. It's the only sound in the city, this faint whisper of movement, this last breath of a civilization that's been silent for millennia. You put the cart back where you found it, careful to leave it exactly as it was, and you stand up and walk on. You find your way back to the river embankment, to the place where you started this journey so many hours ago. The Indus flows somewhere to the east, doing what it's always done, carrying water from the mountains to the sea. But here, where the river used to be, there's only dry ground and the memory of water. You sit on the edge of the embankment, your feet dangling over nothing, and you let the silence settle around you like a blanket. The city is behind you, empty and still. The river is somewhere else, flowing without you. And you're here, in between, holding the weight of everything you've seen. You let the last grains of Indus soil slip through your fingers, watching them fall into the void where water used to be. Each grain is a moment, a life, a story that will never be told. Each grain is a potter's hand, a child's laugh, a grandmother's careful measuring of barley. Each grain is a seal carved with a unicorn, a bead traded from Afghanistan, a drain that carried waste away from people who understood that cleanliness mattered. The grains fall, and you keep letting them go, because that's all you can do. You can't hold on to them. You can't take them with you. They belong here, to this place, to this city, to this civilization that rose and fell and rose again in memory and will rise again whenever someone cares enough to wonder. Historians still argue about everything, about the script, about the rulers, about the end, about the beginning. But sitting here, watching the last grains fall, you realize that the arguments don't matter. What matters is that they were here. What matters is that they built cities without kings, that they made art without patrons, that they raised children without knowing whether those children would ever be remembered. What matters is that they lived, and loved, and died, and left behind enough of themselves that 5,000 years later someone could sit where you're sitting and feel the weight of all those lives pressing down like bricks, like earth, like the soft clinking of pottery wheels that stopped turning long before anyone thought to write down their song. You close your eyes and you listen, really listen, to the silence. And somewhere, deep in that silence, you hear it, the faintest whisper of a wheel turning, the softest clink of a potter's tool against clay, the distant echo of a voice calling a child home for a meal you'll never taste. It's not real, of course. It's your imagination, your memory, your longing for connection with people you'll never know. But it feels real. It feels like they're still here, still working, still living, still waiting for someone to notice that they existed. And you have noticed. You have seen. You have carried them with you through these empty streets, through these silent hours, through these 5,000 years that separate you from the last time a potter's wheel turned in Mohenjo-daro. You open your eyes and the sun is setting, painting the bricks in shades of gold and rose and deep, quiet purple. The city glows like embers, like the last coals of a fire that's been burning for centuries and is finally dying down. You stand up slowly, your body heavy with all you've carried, and you take one last look at the city that has been your home for this journey. The great bath, the granaries, the workshops, the houses, the lanes where children played and grandmothers measured grain and potters shaped the earth into vessels that would hold the daily life of a civilization. It's all still there, still waiting, still holding its breath for the moment when someone will come back and listen. You turn away from the city, away from the embankment, away from the river that isn't there anymore. You start walking, and with each step the city grows smaller behind you, the silence deeper, the distance greater. You don't look back. You can't look back. If you look back, you'll never leave, and you have to leave. You have to carry what you've learned back to your own time, your own life, your own world of kings and queues and concrete and noise. You have to tell them, somehow, that it doesn't have to be this way. That another way is possible. That once, a long time ago, people built a civilization without building prisons, without building palaces, without building walls between themselves and each other. The pottery wheels have stopped. The city is silent. The river flows somewhere else, carrying its water to people who will never know what once stood on its banks. And you walk on, through the gathering dark, carrying nothing but memory and the soft clinking of wheels that turned 5,000 years ago and might, if you listen closely enough, still be turning still.